on to our last speaker. Dr. Shyam Khemani is with the SKP group now, and he will be talking about competition policy, technological change, and innovation markets, some issues and challenges in emerging and developing market economies. So I think this is a wonderful note to end our sessions at. We're going to develop both the emerging market perspective, which is much needed in Turkey, and we're also going to immerse ourselves again in discussions on technology and innovative market issues and the issue of technological change, which was the keynote of most of the speeches today. So we're expecting Mr. Shyam Khemani, please. Thank you.
Let me just see how I work this. Okay, and if I want to change, okay. So I want to go back. Yeah, that's fine. I'd like to thank Gönenç and the organizers of this conference for including me in this very important and topical discussion on competition policy, especially in technology and innovation markets. It's always a pleasure for me to be back in Istanbul to exchange ideas and views with the young Turks, and also harken back to my first visit when I came with a backpack and needed to stay in a hotel with a shower facility. So at that time, the old Pere Palace Hotel needed major renovations. It was a decrepit hotel. And I went and checked in, and as is my habit, I said, my name is Khemani, let me spell it out, K-H. He said, no, it's a good Turkish name. We know what Khemani means. It means, come on, means a bow, you must be a violin player. So that was a kind of a touching note, because who knows, maybe my forefathers were indeed from this part of the world. The topics I want to discuss is the search for the economic growth elixir and the neoclassical and Schumpeterian views about competition and its impact on growth, the role and importance of technological change, the role and importance of competition as a driver for economic growth. And what has already been referred to in earlier discussions is the type 1 and also type 2 errors that can take place in policy implementation. And then I'd like to talk about innovation markets, disruptive business models rather than disruptive markets themselves, and markets where there are free or zero price services that are offered, like the online search or hotels and bookings and so on and so forth. Touch very briefly on two-sided or multi-sided markets because that's already been covered, and then some of the competition concerns and issues. For 6-7 decades or more, economists have been trying to find an elixir for what causes economic growth on a sustainable basis. Unfortunately, we still haven't found that. If that was the case, then my former employer, the World Bank, would be out of business. So we are still searching for this elixir as to what are the major determinants of economic growth. Various models have been put forward based on capital accumulation, on human capital, on natural resource endowments, on the importance of international trade strategies such as import substitution or export-driven competition and export-driven economic growth. What is interesting as I read all these models over the course of my training in economics is that the underlying assumption in most of these models, relates to competition and efficient use of resources as being given. It's been taken as just an assumption, and then people or economists would focus on the role of capital accumulation or the role of natural resource endowments, etc. Competition itself as a driver for economic growth has only come into focus in recent years. And the issues of importance of static versus dynamic efficiencies have come to the forefront. But what is also important is that firms, when they compete against each other, also depends on the business environment in which they operate. And so if the business environment is not conducive to competition and efficient allocation of resources, then no matter what the firm may do, it may not be able to compete effectively either in the domestic market or in the international market. Now, competition matters. That's what the empirical research seems to suggest. Jenny earlier said that the relationship between innovation and competition is very primitive. The findings are very much the case. But what we do know is that competition in and of itself does matter, and it does have certain benefits, many of which we traditionally recognize as being flowing from an effective competition law policy regime. What we have found in various research is that economies which have intensely competitive domestic markets tend to have higher levels and higher rates of growth in per capita GDP. And a lot of this is driven through the process of entry and exit of firms. What we also know is that economies that have intensively competitive markets domestically tend to rank much higher in the global competitiveness index. And so competition does matter from that point of view. But the role played by competition, antitrust law policy, fostering economic growth is not clear. Except in individual cases or industries, we know that promoting competition or addressing anti-competitive practices in those industries have certain beneficial aspects. But whether competition or having a competition law, antitrust regime fosters economic growth or competition in the economy as a whole is a moot question. We don't really know. What we know is that economies do not necessarily have to have a competition law policy regime in order to be competitive. There are many competitive economies which have only adopted competition law policies of late. Singapore is one example, Hong Kong is another example, but many others as well, including China and so on. Okay? So having a competition law does not ensure competition, and you can have competition without a competition law. So why this importance about competition law, antitrust law that we've been spending most of the day discussing? And what it is that the competition law policy does provide a framework in which business is going to be conducted. It plays the role of a referee. If you're a new entrepreneur and come up with an innovative idea and are subject to, say, anti-competitive practices by a large incumbent firm that feels threatened, the question you have to ask is, where do I go for relief? If you don't have an effective competition law policy in place, you're most likely going to be driven out of the business because there is no place where you could get relief. Sure, you could get relief through other laws and regulations in your country, but that does not necessarily mean that they're effectively applied. So the competition law policy regime plays like a role of a referee in a soccer match. Imagine two soccer teams, playing soccer without any referees. And one soccer team just happens to consist of bigger bullying type players. The other soccer team, will certainly lose. So that's the kind of role that I think a competition law policy regime plays in a developing or emerging markets. Now, effective implementation of competition law policy, certainly you need supporting institutions, you need the effective judiciary, regulation, etc. And you need government and, importantly, political support, which is critical. Because if you don't have that, then competition can either be thwarted or competition can be facilitated. Now, what my work in developing and emerging markets have indicated, but generally speaking in industrial organization economics, when we do competition assessments, we attach a lot of importance to barriers to entry. Both policy-based barriers, which are barriers created by government and regulations, as well as private sector or economic-driven barriers to entry. In developing and emerging markets, barriers to entry tend to be much, much more higher than in well-functioning industrial economies of the West that we know of. It's not because of just government interventions in the marketplace. Even when they're not there, they are underdeveloped financial and other institutions. Labor markets do not function properly. Getting venture capital is very difficult, and so on. So one of the issues that one has to confront, even when we are dealing with fast-changing and innovative markets, is there likelihood of entry to take place in those markets should, say, a successful firm engage in anti-competitive practices? And the answer is not that simple. In the United States, we normally think that if entry takes 3 years or more, the barriers to entry are high. If entry takes place within a year, barriers to entry are low. But in developing and emerging markets, entry, even under normal types of products and markets, can take much more than 3 years. So what do we do in terms of policies and their implementation? I don't have the answer. In fast-changing markets, not only do these become accentuated, but there's another characteristic of fast-changing markets, which is the intertemporal nature of price and demand relationships are not there. Normally, when you buy, say, an automobile, this year's model prices will have some bearing on next year's model prices. But when you come across a technologically new, innovative market, yesterday's innovations may not be applicable today or tomorrow. And the short product life cycle that emerges in such markets in itself also acts as a barrier to entry. So in some countries, like for example, Uber came in, the reaction generally tends to be of various taxi drivers and other lobbyists to lobby the government for regulation to prevent that innovation from becoming widespread. Yet in some countries, India is one of the countries that I've been doing some work, they view this as as an opportunity. So if you go to any major city in India, Delhi, Mumbai, etc., Uber is second or third in ranking. There are normally about 5 or 6 different taxi hailing services. So they compete against each other in terms of the platform to see who can come up with more responsive times to customer demands and view that as an opportunity. But each new entrant has to come in with a better model than the existing or the previous model. And so while innovation and short product life cycles can act as a barrier, it can also act as an incentive for entry and innovation, but that means you have to come up with a better designed service or product. Another problem that I have found in emerging markets is that complaints regarding alleged anti-competitive practices often emanate from competitors rather than customers or consumers. Doug Ginsburg earlier said that one of the hallmarks of American antitrust law, but generally all over the world now, is that the purpose of a competition law or antitrust law is to protect the competitive process and not competitors. However, what one finds is that competitors sometimes bankroll or fund complainants as a front to lodge complaints before antitrust authorities. And antitrust authorities in such markets have to be wary of such practices taking place. Excuse me, I'll just take some water. Oops. So we have new forms of business models that we've already discussed today, disruptive forces in many markets, media, broadcasting, entertainment, shopping, travel, etc. We earlier discussed also the nature and types of two- and multi-sided markets, and the fact that doing competition analysis in such markets is not that straightforward. We have a number of examples of multi-sided markets. Now, in many markets, there are fees to be paid. Like, for example, when Doug Ginsburg mentioned Match.com, you have to pay in order to be having an access to Match.com. On the other hand, if you use Google for online search or you use Hotels.com, you don't pay anything. The service is free. And what I would like to do is to focus on those markets where the services that are provided are free. So in two-sided markets, there's, for example, the online search market. You have competition for users searching for information. That raises a question. When you have users searching for information, what is the relevant market that we're talking about? Is it information, or is it narrower than that? Even when we take an online search facility like hotels.com, and even if both of us are searching for a hotel in the same city, we may still be searching for different types of hotels and different criteria. I know economists coming to Istanbul will look for budget hotels, and I know lawyers coming to Istanbul will look for more expensive hotels. It depends on who's paying, right? So what happens is that even when we are thinking about the online search market, we're talking about a huge, huge area where information is not homogeneous, it's very differentiated, it depends, demand-driven, and so on. So when we talk about large market shares of, say, online search companies like Google, the question really is, wait a minute, what is the market that we're looking at? The other point that I'd like to convey is users are not customers. In an earlier discussion, someone mentioned users as if they were customers. You only become a customer when you actually do a purchase. So those who are browsing for information about, say, hotels in Istanbul, right now I may be just searching for information on my hotel choices. I'm not a customer. I'm just searching for information. I'm a user. But I become a customer once I click onto a particular hotel and decide to purchase a room or rent a room for a particular time period that I'm looking for. So usage should not be confused with customers, and neither should it be viewed as being a dimension of quote market, because I really don't know what that market is. By way of analogy, let me give the analogy of a shopping center. If we were to look at shopping centers and say, well, shopping center A has far more visitors than shopping center B, so shopping center A, may be considered as being quote dominant in that particular domain, but one finds that actually the sales revenue of shopping center B are much higher than that of A. And it may be that shopping center A is one of those centers where there are a lot of window shoppers, and shopping center B may be one of those centers where actually has more attractive stores and generate more sales per square foot. So one needs to be a little careful about these types of analogies, and also when we talk about what is considered as the market. One of the issues that has been, of course, this issue of organic search, which I just mentioned. I may be looking for search for, say, information relating to industrial organization Economist, or I may be looking for what are the articles that have been published on technological change and innovation. I'm not going to any particular site. I'm not going to any particular source of information. I'm looking for very generic, very general information. On the other hand, when I'm looking for hotels in Istanbul, that is a bit more specific. And so I may be then aiming to go towards specific search, or I may be looking for, well, I'd like to know what are the recent papers published by the Brookings Institute. So I may put in, in the search mode, Brookings Institute, or I may know already that the web browser address is brookings.com. In that case, I'm going very specific to a site. There is also the issue of vertical sites and horizontal sites in this relationship. And here again, we discussed some of this in the morning, but what I would like to refer to is the fact that when you have an online search company like Microsoft Bing or Google's online search, it may turn out to be that, there was a statement made that there's a bias. One of the allegations made against Google is about bias in the search results, which favor their own companies or services or affiliated companies. Now, if one looks at Google and says, well, okay, let me look at Google Travel, What the relevant question would be, what is Google Travel's share relative to, say, Expedia or Orbitz or any of the other travel companies? Before one would think about Google being dominant in that particular domain. There was a memo leaked by the Google General Counsel, not by him, but it was leaked by one of the staff members relating to the allegations in Europe, which showed that in every specific area where Google has services, its sales were significantly, or revenues generated were significantly lower. So while you may have a company that is dominant, quote, in terms of the number of users, but that does not necessarily translate into leveraging that into market power in the vertically associated websites. That leads to the question of what are we talking about when we are talking about market power, especially in a product market or in a service where there's a zero price. There is no such thing as market power with a zero price. And so what is the issue here? Well, some people say, well, maybe the sale of advertising on the site is an area where there could be exercise of market power. But many of these sites, including Google, allocate the space on their websites through a competitive auction. And what is interesting in the competitive auction is that many of the firms have adopted what is called the second price auction system, which means that if you are competing for prime space on a web page and particular combination of AdWords, then you may bid a higher price, but the price at which you would get that particular space would be at the second highest price. In other words, you get that space at a lower price than you were willing to pay. Immediately, the difference between that is consumer surplus. But the question is, why is that model adopted? And that is because it tends to generate higher revenues because bidders would normally bid a higher amount knowing that they would likely get it at the second highest price. So that is in the interest of the firms organizing the bids, but also in the interest of bidders. But given the fact that the space is allocated through competitive bidding, the question arises is, where's the market power being exercised? Well, the issue still raised is about bias. But remember, real estate is akin to the web page. The web page is real estate. And to get a prime location on that real estate, you have to pay a higher price. So earlier, when one of the speakers talked about Turkish Airlines being better positioned than other airlines, well, Turkish Airlines paid a higher price in order to get that position on the market. A major departmental store in a shopping center pays higher rent per square foot by being the anchor in that shopping center as you enter. Nothing wrong with that. It is through competitive bidding process, and you compete for the market that you want to enter into. So there are a number of these types of issues which have not really been aired out and need to be taken into consideration when one is doing, competitive analysis. There's also this issue about tipping and the fact that a particular site may become so popular that it creates a monopoly or monopolistic situation. But tipping does not mean that the firm does not have to constantly innovate and to maintain its position. At one point, Yahoo was the major online search engine, followed by Netscape, and then later on Internet Explorer. Now it happens to be Google. Facebook, Zuckerberg has announced that he wants to take on Google head-on and is going to become an internet search engine as well. Yesterday's leaders are not necessarily today's incumbents as well. If they lag behind and they don't constantly innovate, then the whole issue of even tipping becomes very questionable. There is also this issue of free ridership problems where, and I'm sure all of us have done that, you go onto a particular website and you search for a hotel room in Istanbul and you really like the Çırağan Palace and you can afford it. And then you go on Çırağan Palace's website to see whether you could get a better rate, right? I do that all the time with airline tickets, And so nothing wrong with that, except that the firms that are advertising and paid for advertising on Bing or Google or other online search engines, find out that they're not getting their share of business. And they may put in some most favored nation type clauses and other restrictive clauses. And then one has to analyze it, as earlier speakers have indicated, on a case-by-case basis. Similarly, the whole question of abuse, we talked already about zero-price markets, where what constitutes abuse. There could be also some sort of a discriminatory or exclusionary practices. Some people have said, well, you don't necessarily have to raise price in order to be anti-competitive. You could make profit by lowering quality. So if you were a product manufacturer, instead of continuing to manufacture that product at the same quality level, you may sell it at the same price but reduce the quality in that product. Is that a viable and strategy or a long-term strategy? If tomorrow, say, Bing was to reduce its search engine qualities, or Google was to do that, what are you likely to do? You're only a click away. You can switch to another website, right? If you don't get the requisite or the type of information that you were looking for on one site or the other. And indeed, most people that I know happen to have, on their computer, not only Google Chrome, they tend to have Bing, they tend to have Firefox and Safari. And indeed, I personally use all of these sites in order to search information when particularly I'm writing a paper. So there are a number of these types of issues that are being faced, and I won't get into the network effects that's already been discussed, but what are some of the implications for competition authorities? Well, traditional approaches to competition analysis will need to be modified. Fred Jenny said that earlier today, and hopefully the OECD, through its convening power, will try to address this issue in a way that can become of some utility to competition authorities that are not just OECD member countries, but non-member countries as well. On the two-sided markets, price structure on both sides matter, but difficult to analyze, when on one side is free. So when we talk about free markets or zero-price markets, or zero-price services, I should correct myself, it becomes very, very difficult. We know that the SNP test is not applicable. We've come to understanding that usage is not an indicator of a market share, and certainly doesn't translate necessarily into market power. But in many developing and emerging market economies, there are cases based on usage rather than having a firmer understanding as to what is driving the market. Conventional competition antitrust analysis is feasible in the advertising market and market power and barriers to entry, but again, they're going to pose some difficulties. And one of the great concerns that many of us have expressed is that there's a high risk of committing a type 1 error. Committing a type 1 error where a pro-competitive action is actually impugned and by the competition authorities, I think is far more severe in its impact than committing a type 2 error where you actually allow an anti-competitive practice to continue by not taking legal action against it. Markets tend to be incredibly resilient. Throughout the world that I've traveled, whether it's in media or courier service or products, etc., someone or the other comes up and provides a service that one did not envisage would be there. And so if you do commit a type 2 error, they're less likely to be adverse consequences for an extended period of time, so long as the business environment in which the firms operate allow for entry to take place, and so on and so forth. There is very little evidence that today's leader is going to remain tomorrow's leader or day after. What we do know is that today's leader, who's a laggard, doesn't innovate, will not be tomorrow's leader. We know that the Internet Explorer is no longer the search engine of preference, indeed has been discontinued. And Microsoft itself admitted that they did not anticipate the changes in the market, they did not keep abreast. Same happens with Yahoo, though Yahoo still has not exited, but there's a number of other search engines that have not succeeded whatsoever. The history of search engines, I would urge you to look at, because you find that the first search engine was created by a bunch of McGill University students in Montreal for a directory of Montreal residents and businesses back in 1992. And from there, we've evolved to what we see today, a huge variety of search engines, not only specific, but also generic ones. We also need to take into account that superior competitive performance, constant stream of innovation, product services, and improvements are critical in order to remain in your market position. You don't do that, you're out of the game. And competition authorities need to be really, really very wary about the fact that often the complaints are fronted by incumbent firms. And often the complaints are lodged by competitors rather than by customers or consumers. I'm not talking about users, I'm talking about customers. Thank you very much.